Hi everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Monday, the 6th of November, where I wanted to talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Also, if you'll look at the notes below, you'll see that we are now registering for the next semester. I've included the link that you can also find on the GCC homepage where you can find our online catalog, and you can find lots of different search parameters there, so time, teacher, modality, and so forth, so that you can get a very refined search if you so wanted to. And I encourage you to register earlier rather than later. The sooner you register, the more likely it is that you'll get everything you want. Oh, honestly, you have up until the first week of the semester. And my suspicion is that many of you are going to need to take another English class, what we call a 200 level literature class. That means it is coded with the number 2. So that means that you are taking a specialized literature class, whether you are focusing on something like an author, or you're focusing on something like a time period, or you're focusing on something like a genre. If you're curious, the course I'm teaching is Shakespeare, and our first play is A Midsummer Night's Dream, so that puts you at a bit of an advantage. It is an online class, so it'll be similar in format to what this class is. But we offer a variety of courses and teachers, about a handful or so each semester, and we rotate. So you can find that by looking on the online course catalog. I encourage you to reach out to your advisor or the advising censor, or both, so that you can register for classes. And if you are very interested in English classes, if you were to take 6 of these 200 level literature courses, you could graduate with a degree in English, a concentration in English. And basically what it is, it's a liberal arts degree, but most of the electives would be devoted to English classes, which means you can move in and out of this English concentration without losing any time. And we constructed it deliberately that way. So I happen to be the advisor for that. If you have any questions, I can certainly answer them, but you can talk to anybody within the English faculty about that as well. You'll also notice below that another class that I'm teaching, and I don't think they've listed my name yet, is the class that I've mentioned before, that I teach a horror film class in media and popular culture. And you can see that in the notes below, the films that we will be doing this semester. It's not an English class, it's a CMN class, CMN 201. So it does not satisfy an English requirement, but you could use it, let's say, for an elective if you were so interested in that. So where we are is talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. At this point, you should have handed in your first paper. If you have not, please reach out to me. I am going through the papers as quickly as I can. It'll probably take me a little bit longer than I had initially anticipated because there was a recent death in my family. But I will certainly get those papers back to you with enough time for you to revise if you so elect to do so for a higher grade. I just ask that you hand in the revision that you write along with the original with my comments on it so I can compare and contrast the two. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to do that. But the sooner the better for everybody involved. And your second paper, and I'll be distributing topics soon, will be very similar to your first paper. You can talk about canon, or you could talk about contemporary relevance, or you could create your own essay topic. Just have that topic approved by me. And as a 116 class, you've got options to either talk about text or to talk about performance. And for A Midsummer Night's Dream, the performance that we talked about was the 1999 Hoffman version, which I had you watch last class. The idea of how do you find a way to translate Shakespeare to the masses. In my Shakespeare class, when we watch a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream, we actually watch a performance that was done in the reconstructed Globe Theater that tries to give a more accurate representation. And since we're watching a performance that's trying to bring Shakespeare to the masses, there obviously are going to be some changes. This is a Hollywood production, so they wanted to entertain and generate profit. And they were successful, I believe, in doing both. Some of the changes they made, I think, helped to bring that about. For instance, using A-list actors, or at least A-list actors for the time in 1999. So that would have been actors like Callista Flockhart and Kevin Kline. Other changes, I'm not exactly sure they were necessary. The time period has been changed, so instead of the 1500s, we're now in the 1800s. I suspect because most people have this general sense of the 1800s and the Victorian period as being one of sexual repression. And that's perhaps one of the biggest deviances in this film, is that we get this opening synopsis, which we don't get in obviously the Prey proper itself, where we're told that this was a time of very high necklines and importance of propriety. And not only does that mean that we're going to get inaccurate costuming, but they've also introduced this, quote, newfangled creation, unquote, the bicycle. And to this day, I really don't understand why the film decided to introduce the idea of bicycle outside of just that it's visually interesting. But that said, some of the advantages of being able to put Shakespeare on film rather than on the stage is that you've got the ability to give all of these great outdoor scenes. They took great advantage of that by giving us all of these lush outdoor gardenscapes. And of course, this is a comedy, so all that lush greenery helps to establish the mood. Notice that when we're introduced to the fairy world, we get a different kind of sense, where it's dark and it's rainy and it's foreboding. Fairies at the time were not known as evil, but certainly mischievous and dark, so they wanted to set that mood. We get special effects, for better or for worse. Sometimes it's nice to use your imagination, but Hollywood does allow us to have things like special effects. We're going to get a condensed plot. Shakespeare's plays are long, particularly something like a comedy that's known for having lots of music and dance. So there's going to be some condensing here to make it more appropriate for a Hollywood audience. The worst change, I think, and there really is no reason for this, is that in the film version, Bottom is given a wife. And in Shakespeare's play, Bottom does not have a wife. And I would argue that it is very important that Bottom is single and does not have a wife. So I really wish they had not made that change. But nevertheless, and as you know, I'm a little bit behind with the attendance form responses, but I'll be catching up with those too. I was curious to know if you thought it was a successful adaptation to bring Shakespeare to the masses. I know when I first viewed that film, I viewed it in the theater, actually, and there was a wide range of people, and they all appeared to be enjoying one themselves. So I think from that perspective, at least in the audience I was in, I think it was successful in bringing Shakespeare to the masses. I don't know if you've ever seen the Leonardo DiCaprio version of Romeo and Juliet. I encourage you to watch it if you haven't seen it. I happen to be a fan of it. They don't change the language at all. They just change the visuals and the music. I think it's quite clever. But that's another attempt to bring Shakespeare to the masses. So the plot is notoriously confusing, and that's because of the theme. And it's not just that Shakespeare can be confusing. I'm well aware of that. But the plot is confusing because the theme is about love and all of the mix-ups associated with love. This is something that we've come to expect in comedies. Comedies are always about love and all of their mix-ups, but there will be a happy ending, which means no death. And that also means marriage or the promise of marriage at the end. We'll get lots of music and dance as well. And also some humor. So, because love is confusing, we're going to be introduced to multiple plots. Notice the complexity here that we didn't see with Oedipus the King. One story with Oedipus, multiple stories now with Shakespeare. And in some ways, A Midsummer Night's Dream is a soap opera where we get multiple couples and they're shifting their romantic intentions with one another. I always suggest that you keep some kind of a chart about the romantic relationships. There also is a theme that's embedded in this, that love is quite fickle, that although lovers maintain that they will love each other forever, they can very easily be swayed to fall in and out of love with one another. But I've attempted to do something like give you a sense of the plot in the notes below in the 4th section. We're first introduced to Theseus and Hippolyta. They are engaged So they represent one stage of relationship. They're an older couple. They're a king and a queen, so they are of higher status. And basically, King Theseus, conquered Queen Hippolyta. She was the queen of the Amazons being a very strong female warrior society. He conquered her in love, or he conquered her in war, I'm sorry, and then he basically earned her hand in marriage. And now he's trying to conquer her in love. This was a very typical kind of love relationship, one that wasn't necessarily based on romance, but it was based on political union. The idea was that love developed after relationship, not before relationship. Hippolyta is not too pleased about the situation. Obviously, she's going to lose a lot of power, and she comes from the Queen of the Amazons. But we also know this is a comedy, so that by the ending, they'll come to some sort of an understanding. Then we're introduced to Hermia and Lysander. They're a younger couple, and they are dating as opposed to engaged, so they're at a younger stage of their relationship. And very timeless, perhaps a universal story, Hermia defies her father. So her father wants her to marry one suitor. She wants to marry somebody else. Hermia wants to marry Lysander, and Lysander wants to marry her, but the father does not approve. In many ways, this would be a very atypical love during the time period, because it was assumed that a daughter would follow her father's will, that a daughter was a piece of property, in effect, that the father could dictate to in any way that he wanted to. What's worse is that the father, Aegeus, doesn't really have a good reason why he doesn't want his daughter, Hermia, to be with Demetrius, because Demetrius and Lysander are pretty similar in terms of status. I oftentimes use the term "because I told you so," if you've ever heard that in a relationship or a power struggle, that the father doesn't need any kind of reason or rationale. He's just made his decision, and the daughters dare to defy him. So that's quite unusual during the time period. Now, Helena and Demetrius, another couple who also are young and were once dating, but are not dating at the beginning of the play, they represent fickle love. Demetrius at once pledged himself to Helena, but then he changed his mind, so he's fallen out of love with her. Worse, he's fallen in love with somebody else. Even worse, the person he's fallen in love with is Hermia, which is Helena's best friend. Obviously, good can't come of this. I told you it was like a soap opera. And we basically get Demetrius loves Hermia, but Hermia does not love Demetrius. Unrequited love. Just like Demetrius, or I should say Helena loves Demetrius, but Demetrius no longer loves Helena. Unrequited love, although he once did love her. So one might say that he has a responsibility to her. So these are all the humans we're introduced to, but we're also introduced to a fairy world. And at the time of the Renaissance, everything had a rank or a placement, starting with God and then the angels and then humans and so forth. And fairies would be seen as above humans, that they were supernatural creatures, that had greater ability to reason. But despite that, they also have their love problems. The king and the queen of the fairies, Fairy Oberon and Fairy Titania, they are married. So that's yet another stage of relationship. So far, we've been introduced to dating, and we're introduced to engagement. Now we're introduced to married. And they are arguing quite bitterly over a changeling boy. So this shows the power struggles that can occur within love relationships. A changeling, and we're given a little backstory here. Changeling is part of fairy mythology. And the idea of a changeling was that in the middle of the night, fairies, who are mischievous but not necessarily evil, could steal a newborn human baby and replace it with one of their own. And this was a way, actually, for human parents to argue that their baby was not really their baby, had been exchanged by fairies, if they felt that their baby was somehow deficient in one way or another. But Shakespeare took that idea and then he changed it to suit his dramatic purposes, that the changeling now is just a boy that was born to one of Titania's serving women who died in childbirth, and Queen Titania feels a responsibility to raise this child. And Oberon wants the child as his servant. And Oberon never really gives good reasoning why, because Oberon doesn't need good reasoning why. He is the husband, the male in the relationship, and the female, the wife, is supposed to follow obediently. He says, give me the changeling, and she dares to say no. Worse, she's even forsworn his marriage bed. So put that in contemporary language, she's denying him sexual relations because they're arguing. So again, we see the power struggles that can occur within relationship. So there are lots of layers here about the different kinds of relationships that individuals can have. Bottom and his cohorts. So this is yet another group of individuals that we are introduced to. They are laborers and humans, and Bottom is indeed that. He's at the bottom of the social strata. He is a laborer, but he also acts like a bottom, an ass. He mangles language. He's very arrogant. He thinks very highly of himself. They're rehearsing a play. They're putting on a play about, well, it just so happens, love. So, and that'll be important as the play progresses. So, as the plot continues, this being Shakespeare's plot, of course, not necessarily the film version that we saw, but the film version still was fairly accurate, where King Theseus, who is the king of the land, orders Hermia to follow her father's will and marry the man her father wants her to marry, or she can face death or a nunnery. And at the time, death or a nunnery would be considered equally horrible. The father, Aegeus, going to King Theseus because his daughter won't listen to him. So in frustration, he goes to the king. And the king gives Hermia some time to consider her options. This is necessary as a plot device so that there's time for her to decide to run away. Very typical response. But one could say it also works thematically. King Theseus has his own love problems with Hippolyta. This might have been a smart move on his part. Rather than make a decision that would anger somebody, perhaps give everyone some time and they could come to a resolution on their own and he doesn't have to get involved. So Hermia decides that she's going to run away with Lysander, and they run away to the woods. Notice that the beginning of the play is in Athens, which represents civilization, rationality, order. The woods, and we've seen this before in other pieces, the forest, the wilderness, that which is untamed, which is natural. Now, Helena, well, first of all, Hermia tells Helena that they're running away. After all, Helena is her best friend. Not necessarily the smartest move, because then what Helena does is that she tells Demetrius that they're running away. Hermia and Lysander. With some convoluted logic that somehow Demetrius is going to feel thankful to Helena and want to be with Helena, which goes to show how love can interfere with reason and rationality. Demetrius does what one can predict. He decides to run off into the woods to chase after Hermia. We're not very smart when we're in love, but we can say that for Helena, I suppose. It's also necessary as a plot device. So Demetrius goes into the woods, and Hermia goes to the woods, and Helena goes to the woods, and Lysander goes to the woods. Everybody's in the woods. And this is Shakespeare's attempt to get everybody in the same place at the same time. While Bottom and his cohorts decide that they're going to rehearse their play about love in the woods so they're not disturbed. Again, this is a way for Shakespeare to get a change of locale, of setting, into the woods. This is where Fairy Oberon, who's so angry at Queen Titania because she won't give up the changeling boy, talks to Puck. Puck is his servant, fairy, and there was a Puck in fairy folklore, a mischievous fairy that would make things like milk curdle and so forth. And we hear about some of that in the commentary. So Fairy Oberon instructs Puck to distract Fairy Titania. The way to do it is to put some love juice on her eyes so she falls in love with the first thing she sees, and then he can steal that changeling boy. So this is a commentary that when you're in love with someone, things that were previously important to you, like your child, are no longer important to you. And it turns out that Oberon overhears the dilemma that Helena has with Demetrius and feels sorry for Helena and decides that he's going to intervene by asking Puck to put the love juice also on the man wearing the Athenian garb so that Helena can have her lover back. The instructions are the man with the Athenian garb, and there are two men with Athenian garb. One is Demetrius and one is Lysander. So this leads for the possibility of confusion, which is exactly what we end up getting. Puck also, on his own, he's never told to do this, but he sees Bottom and his cohorts rehearsing, and he thinks that Bottom is such, well, an idiot, an ass, that he may as well turn him into an ass, a donkey. So Bottom on his own turns Bottom, or Puck on his own turns Bottom into an ass. And then Fairy Titania, when she wakes up after the love juice has been put on her eyes, the first thing she sees is Bottom, who is a literal and figurative ass, with, of course, the rhetorical question embedded in there for all of us as viewers or readers. How many of us have ever fallen in love with an ass? So you can see how timeless and universal Shakespeare is. And she doesn't see it even though everybody around her sees it, because love is blind. And then Puck, quote, mistakenly, unquote, puts the love juice on Lysander instead of Demetrius. Here, an actor can have a lot of fun. The actor can portray Puck as basically making an innocent mistake. He was told to put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. Or perhaps Puck does so on purpose just so he can have a little bit of entertainment. And I've seen Puck played a lot of ways, as well as by a lot of different actors, sometimes child, sometimes adult, sometimes male, sometimes female. You know, Puck is a fairy, so there are lots of possibilities, almost like a Peter Pan kind of figure. But whether it's mistakenly or not, Puck puts the love juice on Lysander, who awakes and sees Helena. So now Lysander loves Helena instead of Hermia. And, of course, Fairy Oberon is not happy. And he tells Puck to fix things, so Puck puts the love juice on Demetrius, so he loves Helena. But the love juice is never removed from Lysander. So now we have two men in love with Helena, no one in love with Hermia, which is the exact opposite of how the play began, when both men were in love with Hermia and no one loved Helena. Worse, Hermia is short with dark hair. That was not considered to be the epitome of beauty of the time, yet at the beginning of the play, both men were interested in her. Helena is considered to be the epitome of beauty, tall and blonde. And, of course, there's lots of commentary here about what is beauty and the stereotypes associated with beauty. Helena is convinced that everybody's playing a cruel joke on her. Hermia is convinced that her former best friend, has stolen her man, and we get what I call the catfight scene in Act 3. Again, if you think about a Shakespearean play, you could think about a kind of pyramid, where at the bottom left-hand side of the pyramid, Act 1 is where we're introduced to characters. Act 2, as we are ascending the pyramid, this is where we get the beginnings of conflict. Act 3, the height of the pyramid, the tip of the pyramid would be the height of conflict. Act 4 would be the beginning of descent, and then Act 5 would be resolution. So it's no mistake that in Act 3, this is when all the lovers are basically chasing after one another and almost coming to blows. If this were a tragedy, they would kill each other. And this is where what I call the catfight scene occurs, that I'll talk a little bit more next class, with a lot of insults. You know, you painted maypole, and you dwarf, you minimus, and you puppet. We'll talk about why some of those terms would have been considered to be insulting. But nevertheless, we do know we're watching a comedy, so things are going to have to be restored. So Puck is going to put things right, along with his fairy master, Oberon. So the love juice is now removed from Lysander's eyes so that he can go back to loving Hermia. A restoration of order is the way it would be viewed. The love juice remains on Demetrius, so he remains loving Helena, which would be also viewed as a restoration of order at the time period, because he had loved Helena prior to the play. Though again, Shakespeare is complex. I don't know if it's a completely happy ending, because Demetrius is ultimately under the influence. But nevertheless, it would be seen as a restoration of putting things right, because prior to the play, Demetrius and Helena had been a couple. The love juice is removed from Titania's eyes, because now Oberon has taken the changeling, so he has shown his superiority. He's gotten what he wanted. And she realized, I'm in love with an ass, as many people realize at the ending of relationships as well, that they were in love with an ass. The donkey spell is removed from Bottom, so he's removed to human form, but he still acts like an ass. And then King Theseus says that because the two couples are happy, he's not going to intervene. So basically, the only person that's unhappy is Aegeus. He's got to accept the king's ruling that his own daughter, Hermia, is not going to accept his will, but this seems to be the best of all possible scenarios. It would seem that the play ends there. It should end there. It could end there, but there is an Act 5. And while the Act 5 seems to be superfluous, nothing is superfluous in Shakespeare. What we get in Act 5, even though we already have resolution to the main plot, is a play within a play. The performance of Pyramus and Thisbe. And this is going to be very important because that play is going to mirror some of the themes that we saw in the first 4 acts. We are going to see a ridiculous performance where everything is taken literally by the actors and the writers in Pyramus and Thisbe. It almost reminds me of an elementary school performance. Somebody has to play wall, someone has to play moonshine. This is Shakespeare's, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit in next class. This is Shakespeare's way to mock his competition by showing us another play and basically illustrating the kind of junk we might see if we ended up going to a play that was not written by Shakespeare himself. We would see poor acting, we would see poor writing. So this is a great commentary on Shakespeare's competition. There's humor in it. Of course, we know that comedies have to have humor. There's bawdiness in it, sexual references that we'll talk about next class. We see how all of the characters from A Midsummer Night's Dream, at least the human ones, are in the audience and having a great time watching the Pyramus and Thisbe production and laughing at it, never once realizing that they were acting equally ridiculous. So that shows a lack of insight on their part, with an embedded message to us as audience that if we're watching the entirety of Midsummer Night's Dream and we can mock all these characters and laugh and not see how we ourselves have been equally absurd in love, then we have a lack of insight. It also is an opportunity to give us a love story that goes bad as opposed to a love story that went well, which is what we had with A Midsummer Night's Dream. In fact, Pyramus and Thisbe might remind you of a very famous Shakespearean play of a love story gone bad, Romeo and Juliet, which was written, scholars think, around the same time period. And we also get the opportunity for Puck to give his most famous final speech, very famous speech in the Shakespearean canon, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended." And oftentimes Puck is seen almost like a Shakespeare himself, controlling and manipulating the action and giving a kind of backhanded apology if he's offended anybody. And by this point in the play, probably everybody has been offended. One thing about Shakespeare, he's equal opportunity, and he's able to show how everybody can act like a fool or an ass when it comes to love. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the plot. Again, notoriously confusing, but I've got notes below, and I encourage you to keep a chart. Next class, we'll talk about some themes and some quotes. My hope is that you have finished reading A Midsummer Night's Dream at this point, and that you are beginning A Raisin in the Sun. I think you will find that to be a much easier play. It's certainly more contemporary, and it certainly is more accessible. This was the play that was not included in your textbook, so I ordered it as a separate edition, but I was able to find a link where that separate edition is online. Again, I don't ask questions about copyright, so you can see this in the 5th section if you needed to access it. You should also note that next class, which is the 8th on Wednesday, we're supposed to be following a Friday schedule, which means that there are no classes for us. So that gives you a little bit of additional time to finish A Midsummer Night's Dream, if you haven't already done so, and to begin A Raisin in the Sun. And with Raisin in the Sun, we'll do what we've done with A Midsummer Night's Dream. We'll watch performance, and then we'll also talk about the action as well. So what's left? It would be just our attendance question for this point. And I thought I would ask, and this will be due on Wednesday, who is your favorite character in the play Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? Who is your favorite character in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? Obviously, there's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just more interested in your thought processes, and you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. I will be catching up with responding to the attendance questions as well, and perhaps you'll be able to find some sort of a paper topic within there, but ultimately there will be a final exam, and while our final exam focuses mostly on poetry, which will be our last unit, which we'll talk about, there'll also be 2 brief questions on short story and drama. So of course, having background and in the short story section and in the drama section, and that includes the discussion forum responses of yourself and your peers, will be helpful to you for the final exam. So, but I'm jumping ahead a little bit because where we are now is still with the Midsummer Night's Dream. So, who is your favorite character in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.